And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this next pretty strong front here, pushing eastward, bringing gale force winds, warmer temperatures and rain to the central Aleutians. Break here along the southwest coast and eastern Bering Sea as winds continue to drop off. And low pressure keeps snow showers going Prince William Sound eastward here for the North Gulf Coast. Next system starts to spread rain in with a warm front over the Panhandle with increasing winds, which tomorrow bring gale and storm force winds along all of the southeast coast. Rain heavy at times again as that low tracks northward and the front edges eastward there. Drying out, clearing out, pretty cold south central Alaska. Back into the southwest interior, northward there to Kotzebue Sound. And this front weakening in the southern portion, but it'll bring some pretty good winds and snow changing to rain for the Pribilof Islands. That same pattern for the eastern Aleutians and eventually into the Alaska Peninsula with blowing snow pushing into St. Lawrence Island during the day on Friday, and quite an area of snow here into the southwest interior. And this system possibly spreading more moisture into the southern Kenai Peninsula, southern Cook Inlet area. Southerly winds, snow changing to rain for Kodiak Island. Areas of snow and snow showers for the Aleutians and all of the Bering Sea. And the front weakens and pushes eastward here over the Panhandle. So winds really coming down and precipitation becoming a lot more showery and lighter. And for the coastal forecasts here for the Panhandle, gale warnings tomorrow. We've got on the central coast actually a storm warning there. South winds 50 knots, south coast south 45 knots, and the north coast south winds 35 to 40 knots. Lynn Canal, south winds 25 gusts 45 knots. Stevens Passage, southeast 30 gusts 45 knots. And for Friday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds 30 knots, south winds 30 knots here for the south coast, central coast, southwest 20 to 25 knots, and the north coast mostly west or west-southwest or variable 15 knots. South winds 20 knots for Lynn Canal and southeast winds at 25 knots for Stevens Passage. And Prince William Sound tomorrow, east winds 15 knots, east winds 15 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast 20 for the western coast. And gale warnings, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, northwest winds 35 knots, Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 20 knots. Outlook for Friday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, and swinging around after becoming light and variable late Thursday night. Friday, southeast winds 15 knots for the Kamishak Bay area, south 20 for the Barren Islands. And the North Gulf Coast, south to southeast winds 15 knots and light east winds at 10 knots with seas down to 2 feet for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 30 knots. Alaska Peninsula, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. 20 knot northerlies for Bristol Bay. And then for Friday, for Cook Inlet, south to southwest winds at 20 knots. And west-southwest here for the Alaska Peninsula at 15 to 20 knots and southeast winds 20 knots with 5-foot seas for Bristol Bay. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Adak and Atka, southwest at 30 knots with 8 to 16-foot seas. And out to the west, winds increase, become southwest 30 to 35 knots from Kiska Island to Shemya. And then for Friday, again, the western Aleutians here, southwest winds 25 knots, southwest 30 knots for Adak and Atka. And for the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings for southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, tomorrow, north winds still at 20 knots there, but east 15 for the Yukon Delta Coast, north to northeast 15 knots, Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. East winds 35 knots. St. Matthew Island, and looking at some good gales coming into the Pribilofs out of the southeast at 40 knots with those seas building to 13 feet. And for Friday, behind the system here, southwest winds, a milder southwest wind at 20 knots for the Pribilofs, and southwest 40 for St. Matthew Island, southeast 35 for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, Yukon Delta Coast east at 30 knots, and brisk wind advisories up here for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound for east winds at 25 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, North winds 15 to 20 knots, and west-northwest winds at 10 for the central and west coast. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And then for Friday, variable winds 5 to 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, but the central coast there and the west side, northeast winds at 20 knots, and 20-knot winds or east-northeast at 20 knots for the Chukchi Sea.